we are the Ministry of the Real Truth. We have had a few comments suggesting that we don't have the original Hebrew text or know of them. That is the original ancient, very old Hebrew text, the Lashon HaKodesh. So we decided on seeking them out, as we, the Ministry of the Real Truth, will have access to the said original ancient, very old, sacred, scribal, old tongue or language, the Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah, aka the said language of God that God spoke, that he spoke to men, and so forth, of the original ancient, very old Ktav Ivri or Avri, the sister language of the said original ancient, very old Ktav Ivri, Avri or Hotep, or the original ancient, very old Hebrew. We found these in great number. Video lessons about the Lashon HaKodesh, and we watched this first one here a little bit, and it's pretty interesting, the comparisons between the Lashon HaKodesh and the Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah. This is of the Hebrew. Lashon HaKodesh is supposed to be the original, as it states here, God's language and his holy tongue, compared with the said original ancient, very old Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah of the Aramaic, the Ktav Ivri or Avri, which is supposed to be the older sister language of the Hebrew. This one is saying originally the Hebrew was the language of God, whereas the translated Victor Alexander says no, the Aramaic was. So there's that difference there, right? But we have found through our personal research, etc., that apparently they were the same languages, right? They had the same words with the same meanings, but at some point, maybe when the Hebrew was modernized or modified, at some ancient era or age, and this dot system was added, etc., maybe the Masoretes or whoever did this, that the words, that the language, the actual structure of the language not only was changed, but the meaning of the words also changed. So originally we had the Aramaic and the Hebrew, the ancient Hebrew. It had the same words with the same meanings. When modified or modernized, then it not only changes the structure but also changed the meaning of the words. So now they have similar words but with different meanings. Example, Yuma, which means a miserable period, unfathomable period. That's when nobody knows, because there's nobody there. When did God start the creating act, and when did he finish? Okay? There's no human beings around at that time to note it orally or eventually write it down. Okay? Or write it down in that period. So we're going to make a comparison of these two different claims, one from the ancient original Aramaic, Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah, Ktav Ivri, and the other on the supposedly ancient Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, because we want to see where the similarities are, if there are similarities, or if there's a completely different interpretation, understanding, etc. Hopefully you understand where we're coming from. We may have to do a second or third part, because the information we were finding, trying to refine in regards to the ancient Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah, the Ktav Ivri, from this translator's website that was down, but we resurrected it. etc., etc., may prove elusive at this point, right? So bear with us. Okay, so we're going to listen to this rabbi here and see what he has to say about the Lashon HaKodesh, and then we'll present you the Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah from the native-born Aramaic speaking translator Victor in Alexander. He's fluent in English and also Aramaic. He might know Persian and something else, as we just found on his website. And it was down, and we restricted it.
Holy tongue. So the question is, why is the Hebrew language referred?
Okay, I'll go back.
The Hebrew language is referred to as the holy tongue. In Hebrew, it's called Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. So the question is, why is the Hebrew language referred to as the holy tongue? Our language are not in any way ever have any relevance to the holy tongue. So Nachmanides, Ramban writes in his introduction that because the Hebrew language...
Okay, we're going to go back, see if we can use the subtitles here. They're not always accurate, and so you can actually hear and see what he supposedly says and narrate on that if there's any discrepancies or whatever that we have in our head.
The Hebrew language is referred to as the holy tongue. In Hebrew, it's called Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. So the question is, why is the Hebrew language referred to as the holy tongue? Our language are not in any way ever have any relevance to the holy tongue. So Nachmanides, Ramban writes in his introduction that
we have to go back and look at that because subtitles give us the wrong
Hebrew language is referred to as the holy tongue.
Okay, so the Hebrew language is referred to as the holy tongue.
In Hebrew, it's called Lashon HaKodesh.
In Hebrew, it's called Lashon HaKodesh,
the holy tongue. So the question is, why?
The holy tongue. So the question is, why
is the Hebrew language referred to as the holy tongue? Our language are not.
Okay, so why is it referred to as the holy language or referred to as the holy tongue? And that should be in their language. It sounds like it should be in their language.
In any way, ever, have any relevance to the holy tongue.
Okay, maybe you're saying something like any other language that claims that it's the holy tongue has no relevance to the actual holy tongue. We're not too sure because these subtitles are misleading, because they hear it wrong or whatever that system does.
So Nachmanides, Ramban writes in his introduction.
So they always refer to some older or ancient rabbi that left his writings, had his ideas, maybe he passed, right? They always seem to refer back to a rabbi.
That because the Hebrew language is God's language.
Okay, so he's saying the Hebrew language is God's language, it's the language that God spoke, that he spoke to Adam, and then he spoke to those men who gathered as one in the desert region of Sumer or Shi'nar and built that ziggurat or Tower of Babel, and they spoke to each other using that one language, the language of God that he spoke to Adam and Eve, and then spoke, gave it to them, and they spoke to each other using that particular language.
And God is the source of everything, all holiness. So because this is his language, therefore it's referred to as the holy tongue.
Okay, so he's basically saying because that Hebrew is the holy language of God,
God, anything God is associated with is holy. The land of Israel is called the Holy Land because that's where his presence is.
Okay, so some would argue, then within an argument, okay, how come they started this? They bombed Palestine, they did all this sort of supposedly horrific stuff. Okay, that's from one person's point of view, perhaps a conspiracy theorist or someone that's in Arabic or Islamic or whatever, living in that Palestinian region. Okay, that's their perspective. Okay, we only know of what other people relate to us. Oh, look what they did to these people. Here, raise some money, help us to raise some money to help those poor victims, all that sort of stuff, right? So we're getting it second hand, aren't we? Okay.
Therefore, it's referred to as the holy tongue. The first language of humanity was the Hebrew language.
Okay, so from his mouth, he states the first language of humanity was the Hebrew language, whereas we have a comparative view which says something completely different from an Aramaic, native-born Aramaic-speaking translator from Bet Narain, Mesopotamia, where all this sort of thing supposedly came from, and so forth.
We read in the Torah about the building of the Tower of Babel.
Okay, so this is the book of instruction, or as Western people or whoever call it, the book of the law. Okay, and a lot stress that you must follow that. If not, you're in big trouble.
When the 70 root families had gotten together and they tried to launch a
okay, so 70 root families, that's according to the Torah or the book of instruction, whereas you have your modern Americanized Bible versions which would just basically say in English, all men gathered unto one place and they spoke one language and they all decided to build this tower. They decided amongst themselves, let's call ourselves a nation so it would be scattered, speaking one language and all this sort of stuff. So they were all united in this one purpose, whatever that was, whether it was good or totally evil. Some myths go they try to build a tower to overthrow the gods and all this sort of stuff, right? And so forth.
Against God, and they were going to build this tower and rebel against God through this tower. The 70 root nations. And the Torah goes out of its way to tell us what unified them, because they were of common language. Since they spoke one language, therefore, that was the basis for their unification. That's why there was such a cohesive group, that they were bent, all in agreement, we have to rebel against God. What is God?
So there was these people in the desert region of Sumer or Shi'nar, okay, all gathered together as one, united and spoke one language. Sumer, which is like part of Syria or a region in Syria or Assyria at that time, but the Assyrians hadn't gathered together and invaded it yet. Right, and these people were like scattered by God apparently and then inhabited the rest of the earth. So obviously there were no Sumerians in that desert region at the time. Be a desert region, what do you expect, right? So there was no one there to be called the Sumerians, even though it was called the land of Sumer.
And he evaluates the situation and he disperses them. The 70 nations were dispersed. And as a result...
Okay, that should be 17 nations. It's these silly subtitles. 1 minute say 17, next minute say 17. It's because it's hearing it, right? It's not translating it accurately. Well, it can't, by the look of it.
So this dispersion, the project stopped. How did he stop the project? So the Midrash tells us that initially they were able to communicate with one another, and because they all spoke the same language, and that's what unified them. So God confused their language. He confused their language. Each person, each one of these families assumed another language, and they weren't able to communicate with one another.
Okay, we have come across some claims, like especially with the Mormons, that there was a certain family there that when this Tower of Babel work was stopped and people were scattered everywhere, that a certain family of this group had these writings or something like that, and they went somewhere else, and then they eventually ended up sailing away and going to the land of America and started up argument apparently with the native Indians or whatever. Then they come to some sort of agreement according to this Latter-day Saint book of Mormon, right, with this whatever's in there, right? And it was the start of the Mormonism movement before Joseph Smith discovered the golden tablets or copper tablets or whatever they were in a certain area in America, and then created that Mormon church. And also that of late there's some Nigerian supposed apostle or prophet, self-claimed, whatever, on the point of saying he's a son of God or a child of God in that sense, but he's hinting at that he's also the Son of God, Jesus the Christ, right? Be careful of that one. Saying that everybody spoke this one language, but when they were dispersed, they spoke different languages, but this one particular group, according to his claims, still spoke that, kept it, right? And he's basically translated into English, started up a, you could say, a following or a cult, depends on how you perceive it, that when translated, we're doing a recall here, he states that the baptism, John the Baptist's form of baptism and Christ's baptism was all wrong. People today who get baptized are doing it all wrong, because he reckons he had a revelation from God that he had to go out in the outpouring of rain in his country, probably Nigeria or somewhere like that, where he is from, and get totally soaking wet, and that was the baptism, that was the correct baptism and all this other stuff. And then all these African Americans, or these Negroes in America, right, seem to think he's the prophet, so they latch onto his teachings, etc., and so forth. And it looks like they were educating their children on it, the different videos and stuff, pictures, images. But he states on his website that we found, you can't be part of his group because you're not pure African. You're a half-breed. You're a mixture of European, or whatever, and African. You're not a pure-breed. So sorry, you can't be part of the group. But they still come out and say, oh, this guy, he's the prophet, and you don't know this, you don't know that. You don't have the Torah. They've put an H there, right? Or it's supposed to be the Torah, right? Well, we found it. Yeah, it's basically that. They've just put an H there. Maybe they might say, well, I don't think this particular group did, but you're not of that colour, of that race, you're excluded, it's not for you, etc., etc. You don't know this, you don't know that, you're not included, whatever, right? They come up through the comments, stuff like that, or whatever we see in their videos. Okay, so you've got to be careful of that one. And of course there'll be others that are making these claims that they are the true Jews, they have the evidence, and God's name is Yahoo Wahoo Wahoo, Yahoo Woo Woo Woo, whatever they come up with, Yahoo Washi Washi, when it's not. Because we asked a professor with 2 doctorates, 2 PhDs in the Hebrew and the Aramaic. These people are claiming that Solomon was black, God's black, Jesus black, everybody in the Bible is black, and that these are the names of God. And he says, what? He thought I was playing games, so he got a bit anti there, right? And he said, no, this is, I'm for real, so I'm asking this question, right? And he must have calmed down, and he said, that's a load of rubbish, that's not his name, it's not even Hebrew, okay? Yahoo Wahi Wahi Washi Washi Woo Woo, whatever, that's a load of rubbish, okay? So it sounds like they're making it up, okay? And then they're claiming that they have this, or something like this, but they may have been referring to this, claiming it as theirs, okay, not belonging to these Jewish people, okay, because they're not the true Jews or this sort of stuff, but they are, right? But we haven't gone further into that in that regard, right? Okay, so we'll go back to this guy, this rabbi.
And because there was a lack of communication, that brought the project to a halt, because there was no communication. So initially, What caused the unification? Same language. What disrupted it was there's no communication, because now is the beginning of the 70 languages, which the 70 families are identified as the root nations of existence. This is when they took on that status of root nations. Each nation has its own language.
Okay, yeah, we understand this guy. Yeah, this rabbi, right? Yep. A lot of it, what he's saying is actually in the Aramaic Brita, or Genesis in English, right? Of that Lshana Ateeqa Supprayah, the Ktav Ivri, and also the modern Bible versions, the Americanized English Bible versions. It's basically saying the same thing. So all good with that so far.
So when they speak about language developing over centuries, over millennia...
Sorry, we forgot to add that, because that's the genealogy in the Bible, right, where Noah steps out of the ark with his 3 sons, and his Noah steps out of the ark with his wife, his 3 sons and their 3 wives, okay, and then they go off and they have their own sons and daughters, descendants, right, Noah's descendants, and they split into these different groups, and it actually tells you there these are the descendants of Shem or Cam or Japheth, etc., right? And it says the Ashkenazis, Magog, Mithraim, etc. And it tells you, what we found with the Aramaic translation is underneath there's always these footnotes, right? And it explains to you, okay, the Anglo-Saxons, the Medes, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and so forth, right? So, yeah, like you said, these 70 families that's, split off, and they each had their own language, so we agree with that.
They develop with other words refinement, but the root, the basis for language, every one of the 70 language, this is something God put in their minds and embedded in their psyche, in their mental state, their intellect, that they speak differently. They speak a different language, and they couldn't communicate. And Rashi cites the Midrash. One person asked for an axe, the other person asked for a pail, and because they couldn't understand one another, there was a level of frustration, they began killing one another. And therefore, that brought it to a halt. So I asked the question. People are not able to verbally communicate, but through motions, hand motions, facial motions, pointing to certain things, you're able to communicate. Language is not the barrier. People overcome the barrier of language. If people are bent that they want to rebel against God to that point, how is because they can't communicate verbally, although they could communicate other ways, that somehow brought it to an end. To the point that there was a level of frustration that it was disrupted because there was internal fighting. Why? Okay? So there's a question which is asked. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, is the one who destroyed the first temple. And the Jews were exiled to Babylon. We spent 70 years there.
So this king that arose, would he have been Nimrod? Or this king who arose decided, because the Tower of Babel, before the Tower of Babel, apparently Cain built cities, or villages or cities or something like that, according to Genesis. So then they got to that point where they actually built structures, towns, kingdoms, right? So would Nimrod have been that first king to do that, as he possibly mentions, right? And then Babylon, as he said, the king of Babylon forces these people to be slaves of it. I'm pretty sure that's what he said. We go back a bit.
Destroyed the first temple. And the Jews were exiled to Babylon.
Oh, okay, later on, yeah, okay.
We spent 70 years there. So the prophet says that because you destroyed my temple and you exiled my children, and the Talmud quotes a verse that because you did that, you will not have a descendant to continue your line.
Ah, okay.
You will not have a language any longer. The Babylonian language will come to an end. So who is the end of the line of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor? Vashti, the story of Purim, who was the queen of Achashverosh, who was the Persian emperor, who reigned the world supreme. She was the last descendant of Achashverosh. And we know the story. Achashverosh, on the 7th day of his celebration of his inauguration of king, he made a request of his wife to come. She spoke disrespectfully to him. And what did he do? He had her killed. That was the end of the line. When Achashverosh killed Vashti, that was a fulfillment of what God said through the prophet, your line will come to an end. What about the language coming to an end? So you say, well, people don't no longer speak Babylonian. So the commentators ask, this is the year 1050, 1100. People still speak Babylonian. So if they still speak Babylonian, that part of the prophecy was never fulfilled. But the Talmud says it came to an end. Where did it come to an end? So
okay. So if that prophecy never became fulfilled, okay, it never came about, then there's a problem there, isn't there? Okay, there's the truth then that a lot of the prophecies made didn't come true.